Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's meeting on Back Bay Fens Pathways. I know we've had a few meetings already on this project, but tonight we're going to be focusing on the Victory Gardens conceptual design. Next slide, please. Wanted to let everybody know that tonight's meeting is being recorded. We also will have that recording like we have with our other past meetings posted on our project website within the coming week. So if for some reason you know anybody who wasn't able to join us tonight, please feel free to share that meeting presentation will be on the website so they can watch it at their leisure. Also want to make sure everybody knows that Boston Parks can offer interpretation and translation services free of charge. Tonight's meeting is going to be in English only because that wasn't requested, but please know that we want to hear all voices. And so if anyone would like to have those interpretation or translation services for any of our future meetings, please feel free to reach out to me and I will put my email in the chat in a few minutes once Kyle starts presenting. Next slide, please. So tonight we're going to introduce the project team. We'll do a quick project recap of what we've looked at so far. But again, this is mainly going to be focusing on the Victory Gardens tonight. So that's what's going to be the bulk of our conceptual presentation tonight. We'll have a question and answer period. And then we'll also talk about our next steps and other meetings that we have coming up as well. Next slide, please. So for those that I don't know, I recognize a lot of the names, but there are some new names that are joining us for this meeting tonight. So for those I don't know, my name is Lauren Bryant, and I'm a project manager at Boston Parks. I'm the project manager for the Back Bay Fens project and several others throughout the city. I am joined tonight by KZLA Landscape Architects. Kyle Zick and Rob Barella are here from Kyle's office, and they're going to do our presentation tonight. Next slide, please. A lot of people ask us how decisions are made for parks. How do we make the decisions moving forward? So we always like to let people know there's a lot that goes into it. And especially in this project, there's more that goes into those decision-making choices than a lot of other parks. So we have things like City of Boston priorities. We have Parks and Recreation goals that we think about for park system and the city as a whole. We have safety and regulatory guidelines, things like ADA. Here we also have things like the Landmarks Commission. We also have the Conservation Commission when we're near water bodies. And of course, community input, which is why we're here tonight. So all of that gets wrapped into how we move forward and make decisions. And we'll share how those all come into play as we move forward in the project. Next slide, please. So this is not one of our projects where we only have one or two community meetings. There's a lot, like we said, that goes into this meeting and this project in general. So this is sort of a recap of where we've been and where we're going. So we started community meetings back in October. We had an on-site meeting where the design team was able to take a walk and talk with people in the park. We worked on inventory and analysis. The design team was out and really did a great job of looking at problem areas that need to have things corrected, where there are amazing views, where things are working, where they're not. We had an online community meeting in January. And then the design team worked on some conceptual designs and started thinking about how we're going to move forward. And we shared some of that at our third community meeting, which was also virtual in February. So we're here right now where that red dot is. And knowing that there's so much to talk about in this park, we thought we would break up those meetings to talk about specific themes. And so that way people could join for all of them if they're interested, or if there's one thing in particular they really want to talk about, they can join for just that one as well. So tonight we're talking specifically about the Victory Gardens. On March 28th, we're going to do a project that's really more park-wide pathways and what's related to those pathways. And then on April 13th, we're going to be having a conversation that is about the War Memorial, Evans Way Bridge, and the O'Reilly Monument. After we do that, we may have another couple future community meetings to show our final designs, but we'll also be working on those designs. The hope is that construction will start the fall of 2023, and we likely will be phasing some of this work. It probably won't all happen at one time, but as we move through the process, we'll know better about a construction schedule and can share that out as well. Next slide, please. So again, saying there's a lot that goes into this and a lot of different groups that we've been talking to. I'm not going to read them all to you, but just so that you all know, we've been talking to a lot of these groups to get their feedback, to make sure that they can help us get the word out on the projects. So we just want to share that list with you guys. Next slide, please. So this is sort of what I was talking about earlier. Again, I'm not going to read all of these, but some of the City of Boston priorities are things like making sure that people have access to parks. We're looking at the climate change issues and resiliency. So those are some of the things we look at from the City of Boston priorities. And then Parks and Recreation goal, again, things that are accessible, making sure that the community is involved and that we hear what you all are saying, and making sure that we have resilient landscapes. Again, this is a really important one for Back Bay Fens. Next slide, please. And then with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kyle because he's going to talk specifically about Back Bay Fens and our scope of work here and some of the priorities that we are working on specifically for this project.
All right, thanks, Lauren. So I'm Kyle Zick, landscape architect with Kyle Zick Landscape Architecture, and our firm is leading the design team for this project, which focuses on the pathways in the Back Bay Fens Park. And so the kind of things we'll be looking at, I mean, we've looked at every pathway in the park, and we think about it from an accessibility standpoint. How is it being used or not used? The stormwater and the drainage, puddling, the materials that are appropriate for those paths. And also, how do we create a path that we know is going to have longevity, that'll be here 10 years from now and beyond, 20 years and beyond, because these capital projects don't come along that often. Next slide, please. So just to orient you, this is what's shaded here with the light green, greenish gray is the extent of this Back Bay Fens pathway project. That's the Back Bay Fens Park. And just for orientation, we've included with these numbers and red dots a number of the different landmarks within the park, just because you all probably think of it that way and not necessarily in plan view. What we're focusing on tonight is number 8, the Victory Gardens. But the park also includes the project also includes looking at the Evansway Bridge, which is 17 at the far left-hand side. We'll be looking at the paths that connect all these different things, but we're not doing anything to Clementi Field, the Rose Garden, the Fire Communication Center, the Duck House building itself, or where the Emerald Necklace Visitor Center is on number 5. Next slide.
Or the playground.
Sorry?
Or the playground.
Or the Mother's Rest Playground. So this map is showing land ownership, and normally we wouldn't have to think about this. You just think, all right, this is a Boston Parks renovation project and it's Boston Parks land, but it's not that simple here. What is in orange is Boston Parks land, and that includes a lot of the pathways we're going to talk about. And that's actually our focus because that's what we want to spend this money on. But what's complicated is that dark orange color around the perimeter is DCR land. So every pathway that you cross or use to get into the park is owned by the state, not the city. And the good thing is the state and the city collaborate, can communicate well. So that's not an obstacle at all. It's just that there is a demarcation there because the ownership's different. The other thing to point out is that the Boston Trust Office owns the land that the War Memorial is on. So the funding for that would come from the Trust Office. Next slide. So then if we apply that same thinking to the pathways, the lighter orange pathways are the ones the City of Boston owns, and the darker orange is DCR, and then the grayish blue is the Trust Office. So most of that doesn't matter to you, except if you start to say, well, what about, we really need to improve the pathway along the sidewalk along Park Drive. You're going to say, well, we agree with you. We've reviewed that. We understand, but we have to talk DCR because it's their sidewalk. But the pathways in the Victory Garden themselves, all City of Boston, so we will talk about those tonight. Next slide. So Lauren already mentioned the different agencies that have jurisdiction over the project. And I wanted to highlight the wetland resources in this park because it's actually easier to point out where there aren't wetland jurisdictions. It's barely not much of the site at all. But the idea is because the Muddy River has a lot of different resource areas. The bank, the associated, the bank is the blue dashed line along the edge of the river. There's a bordering vegetated wetland, which is the green in certain patches along the river. And in Boston, there's a wetland ordinance or a bylaw that has a 25-foot waterfront area, and there's also a 25-foot riverfront area from that bank. There's a 100-foot buffer, and then there's also a flood zone. So that's the red dashed line. So after you get past all those, you have about a third of the Victory Garden and just a little bit of the edge along Park Drive that isn't under the jurisdiction of one of these wetland regulations. And that doesn't mean we can't do something. It just means we will have to get permission to do things. Next slide, please. All right, so as we've started to look more at the pathways, one of the first things we do is always think about safety and accessibility. And a lot of these dotted blue boxes are areas that we knew were pathways that are not compliant according to the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board. So we focused on those very specifically. And the good news is we're able to resolve these issues. Now, there's the devil's in the details there. So at the Pathways meeting, particularly on Tuesday, we'll get into that. But there are two of these areas in the Victory Garden that we'll highlight tonight and elaborate on more. Next slide. So now we're shifting to the Victory Garden. Let's talk about existing conditions first. And as we go through the presentation, please kind of make note of things that you think we've missed or don't know about, or we should know about because you all know this place so well. But in terms of existing conditions, just for orientation, because we've zoomed in, we've got Park Drive on the upper edge of the plan, Boylston on the upper right, the Muddy River is what's colored in blue. And so then the actual garden plots are this little bit darker green, and the white lines or the light green lines between them are the wood chip paths. Then what's connecting all these things are these pathways that are asphalt. So starting from the left-hand side of the page, you have a path that goes along the northern edge of the Victory Gardens all the way to Boylston Street. North of that is a DCR pathway that's concrete. And then spurring off from the entrance, we have an asphalt path that goes to the Central Meadow, and that one that goes to the Grove toward the river. And then there's a stone dust path, stone dust, gravel, mud path along the river as well, kind of tying it all together. Now, there's also some common spaces in the Victory Garden. So I already mentioned the Central Meadow. So that's a large lawn area that has trees. There's a grove a little bit further to the northeast. And then some of the beige or ochre color, there's the urban medicinal garden, the apiary, the pollinator garden. There's an accessible garden and the community nursery. And then the maroon colors are either compost areas or wheelbarrow yards. So we try to get all the different landmarks there. There are a few other things to point out. There's lighting along a portion of one of the pathways, and we have yellow dots along that path. And those have overhead wires. And then there's also a large irrigation enclosure between Park Drive and the first plots along Park Drive. It's with a blue rectangle there. It says existing irrigation controller. It's a wooden box that has the water meter backflow preventer. It's all the water source for the irrigation. And the only other thing I haven't mentioned is the blue square kind of in the center of this diagram, which is the blue phone. It's an emergency telephone in that area. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is some photos of existing conditions. Starting in the upper left, in the upper middle, that's the fairly recent conditions of that pathway along the river. There's high water table. There's drainage from the gardens themselves. There's also just low points where they pond. The structure of the path is probably more dirt and soil than stone. So, and it makes using that for emergency access or maintenance vehicles. And I know you all have had a desire to move dumpsters or have compost removed with large vehicles off of this path, and it's been problematic. Vehicles have gotten stuck. In the upper right, there's a paved path that leads from, there's a path to my back, basically from Park Drive leading down toward the river. And then the intersection is from Boylston to the left and then into the northern edge of the gardens to the right. And that path in the background is fairly steep, not accessible. Actually, the path from Boylston or from Park Drive, none of those are accessible. The lower left and lower middle are both paths through the meadow. And asphalt paths, they're fairly old. They definitely need to be repaved. And in the lower right, it's a picture of a path that could be built connecting to one of those community spaces. Next slide. So then we have a plan that starts to suggest some recommendations. And I'll walk through these carefully. And then, of course, we'll talk about them toward a little bit later in the meeting. So because it's a pathway project, I'm going to focus on those first. So starting at the lower left-hand corner, there's a red line that is the asphalt path that goes along the northern edge of the gardens, and that goes all the way to Boylston Street. So we're going to repave that generally in kind, and in kind means same width, same alignment. We're going to fix the puddles, and where there are really severe tree root issues with the beloved willow tree, we're going to use a pavement called FlexiPave that will still allow water and air to be transmitted to the tree roots. And we can do that very carefully not to disturb them and not put asphalt there. As we head toward Boylston Street, we're repaving to Boylston, but also the spur up to Park Drive. As I mentioned, neither one of those is accessible today, but by raising the grade at that intersection, we can make both of them accessible. And the reason they're not accessible is they're too steep. And the good thing is that actually the garden plots are 1.5 feet or 2 feet higher than the current pavement. So if we bring that up, it actually doesn't affect most of the plots. There is an entrance to the northwest of this intersection that we would have to look at. Now, by bringing up the grade there, that actually makes the steepness of the path going down toward the river worse. So it's like, okay, Kyle, good job. You've fixed two things, but you've made another problem. But the thing is, there actually is a large grass slope here to the east of that path where we could do a switchback path and make that completely accessible. So by doing that, and also improving the entrance off of Park Drive, all the pathways, these major pathways, would be accessible in the Victory Garden. The path that goes along the river, which is shown as a dashed line, we would reconstruct because, as I mentioned earlier, it can't handle emergency vehicles or large equipment. So we want to make that durable and something that's more functional. And beside just that, from the practical standpoint, now that the Phragmites has been removed and the river vegetation is being restored, the views are spectacular. So this is like prime real estate now, where before it felt like the back of the Victory Gardens. So I think we would really want to encourage people to use it. The pathways that go through the meadow and the grove both would be repaved. So that would generally take care of all the primary paths. There's a lighter shade of red that you'll see, the same color that I mentioned with the switchback path up by Boylston for that accessible route. We've had some suggestions to make paved accessible connections to the accessible garden, to the apiary and pollinator garden, as well as the community nursery and wheelbarrow yards. And the urban medicinal garden. So those lighter red are suggesting what could be done to make those accessible. So other than pathways, let me talk about a couple other things related to paths. So on that path that goes along the northern edge of the Victory Garden, there's several yellow dots suggesting light poles. And with the overhead wires, we'd like to put those underground. If we're already repaving the path, we can put a conduit in the ground and refeed the wires, and it gets rid of an eyesore, but also it can be a maintenance issue, like if a tree limb were to fall on it or something like that. Then the irrigation enclosure I mentioned earlier, which is wooden and isn't really weathering very well, we can make a permanent, durable steel enclosure that is more secure as well. And then furnishings are something else to talk about. In this central area with the dashed box, the entrance off of Park Drive, we'll show you some options for that entrance in a minute. But in that area, we'd like to add seating. I think a drinking fountain would be a good idea. The blue phone would remain. And then in terms of other places for seating, I mentioned that path along the river with the dashed red line. We've got 3 locations that we've suggested backed benches. Now, the question there is, obviously, we would want those to face the river, but what side of the path should they be on? We're suggesting on the garden side, because it just seems more comfortable to have someone walking on the path in front of you. Now, those benches could be shifted to the riverside, but you just have to think, all right, do I want people walking at my back? So that's the thought process there. Now, in the Grove, in the past, there's been seating, and it's been removed because the seating was used for reasons that weren't desirable. So the question will be, could a picnic table work there, or would it get, abused? Would a bench work there? It would be abused, or could it be a chair, which maybe is harder for some of the problem behaviors that we hear about. So there's plenty there in terms of things that we should talk about. While I was just talking about seating and furnishings, the next slide will at least talk about the style, because that influences your thoughts on what we'd be doing or recommending. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So on the lower right is a wood and cast iron bench. This is what's used at Jamaica Pond. It's also in the Riverway. So we're suggesting there would be a standard bench in the Emerald Necklace Parks that would be used. Now, in the upper left, if we were to decide that the picnic table was appropriate, there could be something that was complementary to that. Or in the lower left, it could be a metal picnic table that still has kind of references to historic lines, but is a little more contemporary. I mentioned a drinking fountain. There's different options there. The one that's shown here in the upper middle has a bottle filler, an ADA arm, and a other bubbler. And in the upper right is a bike rack. I hadn't mentioned bike racks, but obviously people would bicycle to the Victory Gardens, and there should be the opportunity to secure the bikes. So that's some of the general conversation about the Victory Garden. Now, Rob Barella from my office is going to talk about the entrance to the Victory Garden off of Park Drive and get into some specific design alternatives there.
All right. And I think I realized too that I don't think my cursor is visible to everyone. So I apologize for that. So I'll have to try and describe some things here. So as Kyle mentioned, my name is Rob Barella. I'm a landscape architect and associate with Kyle's office. And I am going to be focusing on the Park Drive entrance a little bit. As we've been talking about, a lot of this is pathways and working on the pathway renovations. But for this particular area, we're focusing on a few different design alternatives, looking at some of those amenities that Kyle talked about and improvements, things like improving the drainage, the pathway conditions, and other types of pedestrian amenities. Now, I'll start with this slide because I think as we start diving into some of the design thought processes that go into some of these options that you'll see, the first place that we started was the history of Victory Gardens and some of that unique character and kind of the background of what these gardens are. And, I'm certainly no expert in the full history of the Victory Garden, but some of the main goals of these and when they became popular were during times of war where these gardens were popping up in either private residences or public parks. And one of the goals was to help with crop production and supplement the crop rations at the time, but then also a sense of boosting morale because it was at a time when the government was starting to encourage a lot of people to become gardeners and start these gardens. And these, home gardeners started feeling this sense of country pride and whatnot, and then benefiting from the physical labor aspects of gardening, and then also benefiting from the crops that they were producing at the time. So all that aside, these graphics aside, all this is showing is that these are kind of the things that we're thinking about with that unique character of what the Victory Garden is, and how can we try and interpret some of these details into some of those designs. So the next few concepts are going to be focusing just at the Boylston Street and Park Drive entrance here. So to orient you a little bit, we have the street view of what that crossing condition looks like here. So this is as if you're crossing into the Victory Gardens, and then that path kind of slopes down and you end up at that larger clearing by the flagpole and that open lawn area internal of the gardens here. So the concepts will be in plan view. So I'll start with on the left side of that red dashed circle there, that you see the intersection with the crossing at the sidewalk. That path leads down into that larger clearing, which is where that flagpole is today. Now, being along the sidewalk there and then along these existing pathways, this is actually a fairly large clearing, but as many of you might know, this area is like relatively underutilized. There is the opportunity for people to have small events there, but there's not really any seating, and there's certainly not too much shade out there. So some of these options start looking at different ways of incorporating some site amenities and different ways of doing some shade and other types of features out there. But we feel that this entrance should be reflective of that unique character of the Victory Garden and kind of serve as a welcomed arrival into the site and looking at that threshold as you enter into the gardens. Big picture, we're thinking about improving the accessibility and fixing some of the issues such as poor drainage, whether it be on the paths or even in the lawn areas, and then certainly resurfacing some of the pathways. And as I mentioned, providing some amenities that will allow more people to kind of socialize and enjoy this space as well. So with these concepts, and I'll quickly run through these designs so that we have time afterwards to talk about these. And I understand that 6 is kind of a lot to be working with. So hopefully, we'll run through these and can absolutely go back and focus on one if there's something particular detail you'd like to talk about. And the thing I want to focus on with showing all 6 at once, though, is that there are going to be some variables and then also some constants between these design concepts, meaning that some of these designs might look different, but a lot of them have a common goal of what we're trying to achieve. So for instance, like some of these constants and all of these options, we're aiming to improve pathway conditions. We're addressing drainage issues on the paths and lawn. They all are providing accessible routes to the public herb and medicinal garden. And they're all considering some level of providing seating and other amenities such as signage. And as Kyle mentioned, drinking fountain and bike racks. Now, some of the variables between these, aside from looking different, the general design approaches vary on how we can improve the space. Some of these range from kind of a small scale improvement to a much larger scale renovation with a bigger change from what's out there currently. Some of the seating opportunities are different in each scheme. The pathway alignments might change, whether it's very slightly or in a larger means. And then there's a different balance of the amount of hardscape versus lawn that's either maintained or new pockets of potential plantings. And I'll start with this. And as I mentioned, there's different ways to kind of approach the design of this area. On the left side, we're considering this to be more of a minimalistic approach relative to some of the other design options. So starting at the far left side, we're seeing a lot of the pathway being relatively what it is presently today, where you start to see some additions of some back seating through here and some other features, these darker green dots being some added shade trees. And then contrary to that, on the right side, this is a much larger expression. This is a much kind of bigger impact to the space. And this is looking at a bigger redesign that builds a space that's more intended for programming and different types of events. Okay, so I will start with this one here. So this is option A. And just so you know too, so option A and B are relatively within the same footprints of the pathways, but looking at different ways of arranging some of these amenities. On here, we're resurfacing all the pathways. That's what that darker color pathway material is. And you'll start to see these added benches on pads around some of these pathways, giving you different perspectives within this, this opening and clearing here. If I start over on the far left side, as soon as you cross over and enter into the space, we have that material change, which is that lighter gray tone there, where that note is saying to highlight the threshold. So we're thinking that this could be the opportunity where this is a fairly visible entrance. How can we highlight this and treat this as a threshold that welcomes you into the gardens, that says that now you're entering into the garden space. As you make your way down the path, you end up at the pathway intersection down here, which is where we're proposing a new accessible information kiosk right along the pathway there. Within that lawn area, that's where the flagpole is currently, and there's also the memorial stone with some plantings around there. The flagpole is staying relatively in the same location that it is presently. We're moving the memorial stone and plantings just to be more visible and access from the pathway. And then lastly, we're also showing the extension. This is the only real new pathway on this option, which leads you into that connection to the herb and medicinal garden south of the page there. So kind of a summary of that, option A is staying a lot with the existing footprints of these pathways, but looking at adding amenities and certain different furnishings around the pathways. Now, option B is similar in some senses, where it's the same pathway alignment as is presently in option A, but we're moving signage to be right at the sidewalk out here, so it's much more visible. And this might be a great opportunity to teach people about the gardens that they're just passing by that might have never made the extra leap into the gardens there and pass through. So that could be an interesting location that's highly visible to start educating people about the gardens. And then instead of doing several small benches along the pathways, doing something that's a little bit longer, where we're calling out the seating note, some bench that's a little bit more of a feature in itself, and that could provide some opportunity for maybe a smaller gathering at that site. We're still providing that new connection into the herb and medicinal garden here in that V shape, which then leaves a little triangle there, which could act as an entry garden and could be a space for that memorial stone to be reset as well. Now that lawn, we are showing some added shade trees in there to make it a little bit more shaded and comfortable. And that's where we could potentially do some other picnic tables or other types of seating out there, including some seatings along the pathway with accessible access. Okay, so that was A and B. So different approaches, but same kind of idea on improving some of the existing pathways that are out there and adding some different amenities. And now starting with this option, option C, we get into a little bit more of a kind of rethinking about this. This starts to reconsider some of the pathway alignments and some of the other features through here. And it starts to get into some different uses for this site as well. And starts to play with some different scales of what this space might become. So we start out at the entrance again, and that's where we have that lighter tone as on option A, thinking that that still serves as that threshold. But once you start to get in here, we've reconfigured the pathways in a way that allows for more welcome signage and welcome gardens through here with more of a kind of first initial impact and kind of a more grand first impression of the gardens through here. And that leads you into this area where these paths are converging into the circular area here with these inward facing seating that's kind of all looking towards that internal central lawn area in there, thinking that that could be more of a programmable space for smaller events and some gathering opportunities as well. And then sprinkled around that, having some shade trees to make that a little bit more of a relaxing kind of social gathering node in this area. Still providing that connection to the herb and medicinal garden and still repaving the pathways, but this starts to look at some new alignments for how these paths kind of converge at a more central social node. Now we're on to option D. And I should recap too. So this is D, and we're getting to F, and then we'll recap back at 6, and then we can go back as needed. Now, option D looks at a larger feature at the sidewalk, really announcing that this is the garden and serving as kind of a gateway into that space. But this might have the opportunity to have some seating through here, possibly some signage. Good guard dog over there. And then once you get past that entrance down here into that circular area here, we're also doing a realignment of pathways, resulting in the central node that's a little bit more central to the space. Similar inward facing benches here, but possibly doing some more of a focal feature in the center with some pockets of more ornamental plantings around the perimeter. Now you might notice that some of these paths are now a little bit different than what they are presently. We're looking at the realignment and looking to see how they can meet up before entering the space. So kind of minimizing the number of paths and bisecting through this. So that's a really clean transition into the social node that then also has the leg that leads you into the urban and medicinal garden. So, and as a summary to now kind of retract back on some of these options. So option D now is thinking more of a larger impression over on the sidewalk level, and then focusing more on that central gathering space in the center here. Option E. So option E looks the most different thus far, and this kind of all goes back to that initial slide that we started with some of those Victory Garden pamphlets and things that would have been given out at the time of the creation of Victory Gardens. So when Victory Gardens were kind of being more popularized, a lot of people there was brochures and plans and booklets all on how to grow your own garden. And a lot of that was centered around this grid, and it was all about being productive with certain types of crops. And it was an educational moment where people who might not have any background in gardening would have this educational booklet on how to grow a garden. So our thought was that on one of these schemes, at least, to do a literal but still interpretive iteration of what that might look like one of those initial pamphlets for starting your own Victory Garden. And that led us to this rectilinear shape here with a thought of some hybrid between hardscape and then plantings that resemble what those original plans might have looked like. So for instance, you might have a ground plan with etched in crop names or rows of the crops, or you might have some pockets of plantings within there as well. On the perimeter then, you have seating that kind of faces inward towards this. So this kind of ends up being this homage to what the Victory Garden plan would have been. And lastly, bringing us to option F. This is, I'll start at the entrance here where we have this light gray color that leads you down here. We're thinking that this is some type of statement that brings you all the way from the sidewalk into the garden space. And this could be, a different ground material or something that's just visual that leads people from the sidewalk into the garden. The pathways here have all been simplified so that they're all now merging at this central node, this ellipse shape here. And this space is balancing the hardscape versus lawn and plantings. Well, so on that darker side here, you have some hardscape for some potential programming of events and other activities. And then while we're still maintaining a good amount of open lawn space as well. Again, showing some of these darker circles here to have a little bit more shade in this space. But this option is starting to balance out that hardscape and that the lawn area, still trying to maintain some of that as some usable lawn space. So it's kind of a lot going through 6 fairly quickly with only one dog interruption. So I guess I wonder if it makes sense to try and go back to some of these, if anyone has any thoughts, or keep on this slide as a summary.
Rob, I think this is good right here. I think what we'll probably do, if it makes sense to everybody, is because the concepts for this portion of the garden are fresher in people's minds. What I'd love to do is to get people's take on these now and then head back to the slides that Kyle showed to get overall comments as well. I also do want to, before we open up fully for questions, just want to thank Rep. Livingstone for joining us. I know that I just want to give you an opportunity to say something if you wanted to jump in as well. Steve, can we make sure that Rep. Livingstone is unmuted or able to unmute?
Thank you, Lauren, and thanks for this presentation. This area is new to my state representative districts as of January, although it's an area I'm very familiar with as I live a few blocks away in Back Bay and walk through this. I am most excited about the repaving and regrading of the paths. I have been in the mud that was shown on those pictures many times and looking forward to that. But mostly tonight, I'm looking forward to hearing from the other members of the community on what they want to get out of this and ways that I can amplify those thoughts. And then I guess the one question I had is, I didn't know if there was coordination between the city and the state regarding the intersection where the Bowker end ends and Boylston Street begins, as the bridge on that side of the Mass Pike is going to be replaced, and there's been a lot of design work to make that much more pedestrian and bicycle friendly.
That's a really great
thank you. Mostly thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us. And the coordination with DCR is a really great question. Rob, I don't know if we can jump back really quickly to the slide from earlier to help show the differentiation. So one of the things, one of the DCR pathways, one of the things that this one's perfect. So everything in that dark orange, so everything here is what's in our scope, and everything in the dark orange is DCR owned pathways that are inside the park, and everything that is in the light orange yellow color is Boston Parks owned. So we're doing quite a lot of coordination with DCR because like we can't touch our pathways without crossing state land. So we're definitely doing quite a bit of coordination, but nothing necessarily at that overpass. So I hope that helps. And again, this just goes to show, talking about everything that we talked about in the Victory Gardens, just how much there is to talk about in this one small part of the project, which is why we're trying to break these up to talk topically. So Rob, I don't know if we want to jump back now to those 6, and then I know Pam had asked if now's a good time for comments. So yes, please, anybody that would love to give us comments, feel free to raise your hand. We can let you guys unmute. If you want to speak, please do. If you want to just add your comments in the chat, that's totally fine as well. I see Marie's hand is raised. Could we allow Marie to unmute, Steve?
Go ahead, Marie.
Hi. Thanks for this. I keep on thinking I'm gonna listen and not say anything, but I guess I'd just say, since I live in the Fenway mostly because the Back Bay Fens is here, I'm not surprised that I have a desire to talk. These are super exciting concepts. A few things I wanted to raise is that the entry point that you have to the very left of all the concept plans is currently used not only by parks vehicles who then circulate through the central area for trash pickup and maintenance, but also by gardeners who go from the left-hand side through to what you would call the meadow area to drop compost. I think that we also get compost drops from other contractors there for use by Victory gardeners. So in that sense, my concern in seeing concept C, D, and others is that circulation by vehicles for gardeners would be impacted. And I'd say because the Victory Gardens exist for gardeners, that would be my primary concern with any of those concepts. The other thing I wanted to raise is that while accessibility for paths is really, accessible paths into plots is a concern, so is the fact that we don't have any long-term guarantee for the use, for continuing the use of specific plots such as the medicinal garden, the pollinator garden, etc. What that means is that the Garden Society now is maintaining out of their volunteer efforts all of those spaces, but they're not codified in any way, at least to my understanding, in the memorandum of understanding between the Garden Society and the Parks Department. I've seen a number of gardens come in that were public use, such as the herb garden that Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum established that went away when the caretakers went away. So I think, you know, if we're talking about paved access to specific plots, just because it does cut into park land and turf, which is in great need in the Fenway, I think that it should be concurrently updated in the agreement. Yeah, so if we're talking about preference, I think concept A seems the most minimal and to me exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. And I appreciate the reminders about the vehicular access. That's really great to hear. And I think, you know, part of what we can also talk about is if there are people that prefer one of the concepts that currently might be a little bit more challenging with vehicular, and Kyle, you can correct me if I'm wrong, some of those might be able to be updated if people like some of the aspects of them in order to help make them more vehicular friendly. Is that a good way to put that, Kyle?
Yep, and it was a great comment in the chat. You know, potentially there could be a designated vehicular entrance that isn't here that could take that wear and tear and be appropriate, more appropriate if we decided that vehicles shouldn't come here.
That sounds great. Thank you. And Pam, your hand is raised. We could let Pam unmute as well.
Sure, go ahead,
Hi.
Pam.
Thank you. I'm delighted to see this. Just the creativity that's gone into it. I had planned to say what Marie said. I will just amplify it by saying we also get approximately $6,000 worth of product delivered from Home Depot once a year. And they've come through that entrance as well. And when it's delivered, we actually need access to preferably the Grove for that product to be unloaded and distributed to gardeners. I love the entrance at option D, where basically you're on the sidewalk and hey, you know what this is. Because we have a lot of people who come in the gardens and will ask a gardener, what is this place anyway? The vehicle traffic is a real big issue. The other issue is when I look at concept E, you're putting in a new common space that needs to be gardened, and you're putting in a new garden space much smaller in concept B. And the question I would ask is that the Fenway Victory Gardens who maintain that with their volunteer labor, or is that the Parks Department? And I don't mean that as a hostile question. I just mean to know that if it's Fenway Victory Gardens, we need to know that that's our responsibility. I'm sure I've got a dozen other comments on this as we looked at the ones between them. There is an electrical box that was not on your as is drawing. That is, as you walk in from Boylston Street, what the entrance, it's sort of to your right underneath a witch hazel tree. I don't know what that has to do with how that affects anything. Yeah, the vehicle access is the big thing. Also, where the new blue box is going to go will be an issue. And finally, the issue of seating and benches. Long-term gardeners will tell you that basically the undesirable behavior that happened when we had seating was pretty horrendous. That there was a seat in front of the bulletin board that we currently have, and basically it was always a pile of needles in front of it. Now, I haven't been in the gardens long enough term to know that that was the case. One of the things also missing from the as is the FGS bulletin board, and you've got places where you have you labeled accessible signage, and I want to know if that's our signage where we can put up notices to gardeners, or if that's signage that's just going to be history of the gardens and general information and permanent. So I mean, I guess I'm asking as much questions as making comments. But the main comment is that concept, the entrance where when you're on the street, you know what this is. And if you could actually put something in the pavement that said, you know, Fenway Victory Gardens established in 1942, that would be terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. That's helpful. And in terms of your question about signage, my question would be, what is it? And I know you've sent us some information already, but just for everybody else on the call to understand, in terms of signage for the garden itself, what is it that you are hoping that could be?
I would say two things. One is something that tells the visitors where they are. And the second thing is a place where we can put up notices on the bulletin board, put the schedule of when our community work days are, put information about invasive plants, put information about the Fens Fest event that'll be happening at whatever time in the season. Just sort of, changeable information during the season.
Perfect. Awesome. I just want to make sure everybody understood the difference between those two things that you were asking about as well. And I think from what Kyle and I have talked about is that we think there's an opportunity for both of those here.
That would be great.
Perfect. Anyone else have any other questions for us or any other thoughts on these concepts or want us to look back at any of them zoomed in while we're on these slides? Oh, there we go. More hands raised. Perfect. Allison, I believe your hand is raised next.
Allison, go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thank you. A question about the plans with the new shade trees. Maybe if you could be more specific about what you mean by shade trees related to how tall you want these trees to be in relationship to what the trees that are already here. And if you're coordinating the location of the shade trees with where people will be sitting, I think. But I'm just thinking about, are these like flowering trees? I mean, a true tree canopy doesn't really achieve good environmental impacts until they're 30 years old. So is that what your goal is here?
So I guess these are very conceptual drawings. So I think at this point where we have a proposed tree, we have not thought about species yet. We are thinking about framing spaces, providing shade for, in the future. But I don't think I have answers to all your questions yet. I think further down the road we will.
Right. I think it's something to think about, and maybe to, when you're talking about this, you could actually specify how much room there is for how many trees too. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. I appreciate those thoughts. Brian, I think you're able to unmute now.
Yep, go ahead,
yes.
Brian.
Hi, this is actually Brian's wife, Laura. We're both on the call.
Welcome, both of you.
Thank you. Very exciting to see. And I really just want to thank Pam and Marie for their comments because they basically said everything I wanted to say, but just to add, I think one of the high priorities is, even though maybe small, is the water fountain. That'll be huge. Like I know I carry all my water to drink in the summer, and if I can have a water fountain, that would change my life in a good way, easy, good way. I do also I usually bike to my garden. So bike access, I think, isn't a problem now, and hopefully wouldn't be, and a bike rack even would be great. But I also drive in often to unload quickly things. So I think I definitely want to, keep and access. The concern I have is with concept F, it almost looks like a great parking area. And we don't want to encourage people to come and stay and park, gardeners even. So, because I think and Pam can confirm, but it's about, 20 minutes, get in and get out, because we don't want people to linger, obviously, because it is a park. So that's my only concern with concept F, although I do like the ellipse and the circular areas. So thank you guys for your work on this.
Perfect. Thank you, Laura, for those comments. And that's exactly why we do all of these different comments, is because we want to hear the thoughts of the people that use this space all the time. So I really do appreciate those. Stephen, you've got your hand raised.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, beautiful. I'm Stephen Exter. I'm the vice president of the park for the Garden Society. And I just wanted to echo a few things. One, obviously there's a tremendous amount of work that has gone into this, and a lot of these improvements, especially with the paths and the roadway along the rear of the gardens and the Muddy River, which will make a huge difference. I would like to, so this is my first year on the board. I've been a gardener for 10 years, 7, 8 years, something like that. My wife and I and my kids spend a lot of time in the gardens. And I just wanted to echo something that a point that Marie made, which is that really I want to be sure that like this is still a sort of a living, functioning space for gardening. There's a really active, obviously vibrant, passionate, diverse, interesting community of people who do this. So, and I think I want to be sure that while we're highlighting the history here, we don't sort of want to stray too far from that purpose. Victory Gardens are, it's not a museum. It's not, this is something that happened back in 1942. This is something that we're still using these very actively now. And finally, I just wanted to say, let me see, sorry, I just have to check my notes. I don't know if I apologize if this has already been discussed, but is there, with any of these improvements, in particular the ones that sort of create new large-scale gathering spaces, seating, things like that, I think we would have to have a vastly increased police or ranger presence. Is that going into sort of, is that part of decision-making or part of your design? Because security and safety is a very significant and daily issue for us here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it. In terms of the police presence and ranger presence, it's something that we talk to both of them as part of all of our projects that we do in Boston Parks, and definitely have been letting them know what we've been hearing at these community meetings in terms of the concerns. So yes, the thoughts on safety are always part of the decisions that we make in terms of what those thoughts will be moving forward. Absolutely. And I saw, Diane, thank you for the comment in the chat about police phones as well, on that same line of thinking. Anybody else have any other thoughts on these concepts? I know that I want to make sure that we have a chance to hear any thoughts on sort of the overall garden pathways as well. Any other thoughts while we're on this slide? We can always jump back if somebody thinks of something later too. Kennedy, yes, you've got your hand raised.
Go ahead, Kennedy.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. Just a question on the security aspect. Oh, by the way, my name's Kennedy. I work for Counselor Box Office. We do hear these complaints and concerns from residents a lot. And so we work with BPD and also supportive services in the area. So folks are getting the services they need. But I was just wondering from like a landscape design aspect, I know that the hope would be that when you better engage a space, more people use it, and the activity kind of by proxy dissuades some of that activity. Are there certain elements of the design that could benefit positive uses of the space? I mean, I think you're doing it. I love the designs, but just a question. In addition, not saying that park rangers and BPD attention is a bad thing. I understand that being a necessity, but just wondering on the proactive side of it.
Absolutely. Kyle, do you want to talk about that with any of the design aspects of it?
Sure. Yeah, I think with any of these options, we're trying to, improve visibility, information, and have the ability to gather and make that gathering, at least in these options, visible from the street and from garden pathways. And I think, activity in these spaces can dissuade bad activity, but I think there's other areas in the garden that are less visible that, we have to consider as well.
And I think one of the things that I'd appreciate hearing a little bit about too is just like with any park, any project that we do, there are always lots of different opinions coming in and lots of different input. One of the questions that I have is, we've heard that, there are a lot of gardeners here. There aren't a lot of spaces for people to come together when they see each other in the gardens to have that gathering space. But we also hear the concerns about what happens in gathering spaces when negative behavior happens in them. So I'd love to hear maybe if people, even if you're willing to just throw a couple comments in the chat, would be, from a gardener's perspective, how important is a gathering space? And if that is important to you to be able to have that social interaction with other gardeners, what kind of size, what kind of space, how many people? I think that would be a really interesting thing to hear. Kyle, I don't know if you have those same thoughts, but just because we're trying to balance that, trying to really understand the needs of a gathering space, I think could be really useful. So if anybody wants to say anything about that, we can do that too. But I also know that we want to jump back to those other slides as well.
Marie, go ahead.
So I guess it's a number of things, and it's pretty interesting. So we do contend with undesirable use, and it is, people who have drug use problems, but it's also Red Sox events where, people come before or after events, and sometimes the loitering doesn't necessarily bring anything to the gardens or the gardeners, and plots get damaged as a result. We also use the existing lawn spaces now for informal gatherings. There's been everything from, memorial services for gardeners who passed away to Porch Fest music events. We've done temporary art installations on lawn areas, and then the yearly Fens Fest Garden Festival, which usually takes place in the meadow area. And I think in that sense, having the flexible openness of the lawn has helped, because we can kind of set up tables and activities, whether it's going to be a kid's game or face painting in different areas, without having a, existing architecture limit where it is that we set up or break down. So I don't know if that helps, but it's more just describing how we've used the space.
No, that's really helpful to hear, Marie. Thank you. And thank you to those that also put some comments in the chat too, helping to understand some of that use pattern as well. Matthew, you've got your hand raised too.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. Maybe this is a little bit snarky, but my favorite gathering place in the garden is just like the compost heap. 'Cause you'll see people around, and like we work together on it on our community days. And so, I don't know. I feel like gardening is a very active standing activity, and like we don't necessarily need places to sit for that. But yeah.
No, it's not snarky. It's good. That's why I said everybody has different thoughts and uses and how they use the space and how they see the space used. So that's why we want to hear all the voices. So don't ever worry that it's not the right thing to say.
And I guess one other thing I'll just chime in with, in terms of safety, the two paths that get the most foot traffic in the garden are the one along the street is the most, and then the other north-south path parallel to that gets a good amount of foot traffic as well. Okay. And so I think if we are trying to like create a space for people to sit where they won't be like hidden at night, this entrance spot is a good place for that. So yeah.
No, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate those thoughts, Matthew. Stephen, you've also got your hand raised.
Yeah, just briefly. I think that the meadow, as it is now, it's sort of a green space, a lawn. It functions well as a gathering space when there are gatherings. But for the most part, and I'm in the gardens a lot, I think the gardens are best enjoyed, and it's sort of a touring place where you walk up and down the rows. You look at what people are growing, at the flowers, at the vegetables. You enjoy the wildlife. We've got incredible population of hawks, and we've got some amazing trees. The canopy is absolutely fantastic. So it's, I don't know, I never really think of this place as a place to come and sort of sit and gather as much as to sort of stroll and walk and enjoy it that way. And I think that the work that was done, along the Muddy River just sort of amplifies that possibility and that usage. Bird watchers as well. Yeah, that's big time too. But so, rather than sort of picking out a spot, or trying to find a spot that's available to have gatherings, it's I think that potentially changes significantly, and I don't know, maybe for better or maybe for not, but the sort of the character of the garden and what it's used for. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I like hearing everybody's different perspectives of how they see and use the space. Rob, could we jump back at this point, I think, to some of those earlier drawings that Kyle was talking about? Yes, thank you. Because I want to make sure that I'm glad that we got to talk about the entry space to the garden, but I also want to make sure that we talk about the garden as a whole too. Kyle, is there anything that you want to jump in on before we open it back up that you might have heard, or any questions that have come up that you want to reemphasize anything here?
Well, I think we've gotten good feedback on the entrance. We've gotten good feedback on some of the pathways, and I think we've heard about seating. I guess I'd like to know more about benches along the river and people's thoughts there. If that's visible enough, or if they think that's going to, encourage some bad behavior.
Pam, you've got your hand raised.
Yeah, so my garden is not along that back row, but I can tell you if there were a bench that basically serves as a 2 to 3 foot high step to climb the fence of my garden, I would be very upset. Because I think you get enough break-ins as it is to put basically a step ladder into your garden next to your garden is a very bad idea. I think putting the bench, part of the issue is we've got this 4 foot black chain link fence that is part of the Muddy River Restoration Project that will be up for 2 years because that's how long the contractor has guaranteed the landscaping for. I don't know if that fence comes down afterwards. If it does, there's the opportunity to put benches kind of scattered near the river with views pointing in different directions. And they are gorgeous views. But putting the benches, I have 2 fears. One is that the bench is right next to a garden. That garden is going to be broken into weekly, if not daily. And putting the benches along that path with the fence there narrows the path in such a way that I'm not sure our dumpster delivery truck can get through. I mean, the bench is going to be 2.5 or 3 feet wide. So those are my comments about the benches in the back.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Pam. I appreciate that. Kyle, I know you had some specific thoughts about benches along that edge. Do you want to talk about that too?
Well, I mean, I think Pam raises some good points, the step ladder and the chain link fence. So I think we need to study this a little harder. I mean, I mentioned it earlier, I'm concerned about, and I think the chain link fence may limit the possibilities to even put the bench on the river side of the path. And so then, that you don't even need to talk about having people at your back at that point if the bench is up against the chain link fence.
Yeah.
Marie, go ahead.
Yeah, is it only the benches or is it everything on this slide?
Everything.
Talk about anything, Marie.
Great, okay, I'm gonna make it super short. So I agree with what Pam said, and I guess I'd add to it that it can be really hard to maintain plantings along fence lines. That's where a lot of times we have the, I'd call them weed trees, but that's not a nice thing to say, but mulberry and Katsuta silver maple, they come up and then after a few gardening seasons, the gardener gets overwhelmed, and it's the biggest problem area of trees within gardens, which is an issue that the Garden Society board has to then deal with. So keeping things away from the fence helps areas to be weeded, let alone the fact that a lot of times people like to smoke on benches and do things, and gardeners that are next to those benches might be looking for just a quiet moment in their plots. So I think that the vistas would be great. I think from my memory, people tend to gather near the south center compost. And it might help with some of the problems that we've had in the past with people dragging crates and things and leaving them in the reeds. Although I do have concerns about what people will be doing on the benches. I do think that they should be afforded that opportunity. I did want to comment about the new accessible path drawings that come into the wheelbarrow yard. Just to say that I think that that lawn area for me, I have to go through that area because my plot is past it. So I could see the utility of having a paved pathway and not having to slog through the mud. But I also am concerned about having the lawn panel lessened by yet more paths. And I guess I'd say that whole area seems to be very soggy. And I wonder if access, you know, by gardeners could be improved just by some type of, I don't know, can you raise the grade and improve the plantings? The arborists that we've had look at the existing plantings has said that some of the issues with the tree health there has to do with the dampness. And I don't know if it's like a water table issue that could be solved or not, but okay. And then the switchbacks, the new accessible route up near the Boylston Street Bridge, that seems like a really great way to improve the accessibility at a steep grade. I do wonder with the vista that visitors have at the historic Boylston Street Bridge, how that would be impacted. And Kyle, you're so good at the historic parks design. So I think just, you know, being sensitive about how that vista will look with an integrated switchback would be a good thing to do. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Marie, thank you. And I think, and I appreciate the comment about that vista, and we can study that for sure. The other thing I just want to double check or just make clear too, the rationale for the accessible pathway to the area where the wheelbarrow yard is wasn't about the wheelbarrows. It was about the fact that that's the accessible garden. So what we were looking for is getting an accessible route to the accessible garden. Was the thought process there? It wasn't about the wheelbarrows. That's correct, Kyle, right?
Well, and then there's a second wheelbarrow yard next to the community nursery. So that path is leading you to the community nursery and the wheelbarrow yard.
Okay. And then Kyle and Pam, I see your hand too. Kyle, there was a comment in the chat that was asking about any plans for new lighting on the paths that are going to be repaved. Do we want to talk a little bit about new lighting?
Right. So, and we would, I mentioned the existing lights, and I know in the chat there was some comments about the existing lights. We would definitely underground the wires. We'd have to talk to street lighting about changing the fixtures. But otherwise, we don't have any new lighting on existing paths or proposed paths.
Okay.
Okay, Pam, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Lauren, the accessible paths that I feel we need are the ones up in the grove that go to the pollinator garden, accessible gardens. The paths to the wheelbarrow yards are more desire lines than acceptable paths, because honestly, I'm not sure someone in a wheelchair can push a wheelbarrow. So I wanted to make sure that that distinction was clear. I have a concern about the top right-hand corner in that switchback, in that I was out there with some Northeastern students measuring the slope there. And I actually think it's the slope from where all those paths intersect up to the street that is too steep for ADA to meet ADA requirements. So I actually think that the switchback as drawn there will not serve a purpose of making that compatible. I could be wrong, but I wanted to just encourage you to recheck that, because I think the problem is coming down from the sidewalk to that intersection.
Yeah, Pam, you're actually right. It's both. The path from Park Drive and Boylston Both of those are too steep. So we're actually proposing to resolve that. We could raise the grade at that intersection in the where the switchback starts. We raise that about 2 feet. Both of those paths would be accessible. And then the switchback is long enough to be able to make the path accessible from that intersection down to the lower path.
Okay, so there's a major grade raising that goes on there. Thank you for that information. Yeah. I wanted to add that when you do some of this, if you can add curb cuts. Currently, we want to have the dumpster in what's labeled the Boylston compost, which is the biggest of the 3 compost areas. And the dumpster delivery people would love to come in at the Park Drive entrance in the lower right-hand corner, drive forward, leave the dumpster, and then continue going out, going straight. And similarly, when they go to pick it up, to come in, pick up the dumpster and drive out on at the top of the map. What they did last year when they put one dumpster there is they backed in from Park Drive to that compost and then backed in with the dumpster. And then when they came to get it out, they backed in and pulled it out going forward. So that's just, you know, a little piece of information in terms of if you made their life easier. I don't know. I don't want to, you know, if that's possible and easy, we should think about doing that. And then, yeah, we had talked at length, I think, about the ADA pass to the pollinator garden, the accessible garden, which I feel pretty strongly about that. You know, our accessible garden is not accessible until we have an accessible pathway to it. And I think that's all I've got for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. I appreciate that. And Steve, I see your hand raised, but I do want to address a question that was in the chat that came up as well. Kyle, there's a question about the Riverside pathway width and whether it's going to be widened from what it is now or whether it would be a similar width.
Yeah, we've got to study that a little more. It's actually difficult to measure the existing width because it creeps so much as people avoid puddles. But you know, we want to make sure it's sized appropriately for the pedestrian use, but also the vehicular use we've heard tonight, the dumpster, you know, the compost or emergency use, that kind of thing, but not have more pavement than we need either.
Thanks, Kyle. Steve, I know you've got your hand raised.
Hi. Just, you may have already discussed this, and I apologize if I missed it, but Kyle just, I think, referred to the existing light fixtures along the path, along the upper, that sort of parallels Boylston, but is one path in from the street. Those, my recollection is that those were installed as quote unquote temporary lighting in the Flynn administration. They are completely out of character for this park and out of scale for humans who use the park. So, and if there's some question about not doing it, I just think they're, you know, there's something I would expect to see on a street, you know, on a highway in Stoughton or something, not in an urban setting, an Olmsted Park. Well, used to be an Olmsted Park. So I'm just wondering if you've given some more thought to that than just saying we have to talk to the street department, and maybe you just haven't had those talks.
Right, so
yeah, we have, go ahead, Lauren.
Well, our plan is, we don't like them either, right? Our plan is we would really like to switch them out. We don't own those lights. Boston Street Lighting does own those lights. So that is our hope, to switch them out to something that is more appropriate for the park. But because we don't own them, I can't say, yes, we are doing that. So meeting with them and collaborating with them is part of this project, and we will be continuing to do that. But until we have a final say from them, I can't 100% tell you that's what we're going to do, but that is our plan and our goal. Is that where you were going to go, Kyle?
Yes.
Okay. It's good that we're on the same page. Perfect. I see some other comments coming in with the chat too, so this is really helpful. Kevin, I see your comment about the puddles and the berm, so we'll definitely make sure we're looking at that as well. Any other? Oh, Jack has his hand raised.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Lauren and Kyle and everyone for everything you're doing here. It's a lot of thought that's gone into it. I have a bunch of thoughts, but I'm going to try to keep it to the most important ones or just ones that I think might be new for you all because I've enjoyed listening to everyone. But big things that have come onto my mind is that I really want this to be accessible for maintenance crews that need to get in, but that's come up already. I'm excited to hear you mention in the chat that there might be some irrigation options because I want any new trees and plantings that go in just to be cared for. And I think that can be a long-term conversation with the Conservancy and other folks, but it's easy to put plants in and then forget about them. And then one other thing is that there have been some conversations up the river about the Coffer Dam at the intersection of Park Street that it's been under debate whether it's going to be removed or not, and it's still not entirely decided and communicated to the public, but it's and I mentioned that.
Jack, it sounds like we might be missing you, and we're cutting out a couple of words here or there. Could you just repeat the last sentence or two that you said?
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. It might be my internet.
It might have just been me, but I just want to make sure I could hear you.
Yes, I could send it in a separate note too, but the upstream dam removal conversations might end up impacting the water levels in some of these areas. And I've seen some pictures from recent storms of erosion coming off kind of this like south part of the Victory Gardens. And I can send those pictures to Kyle and others, but that might be a conversation you all want to keep your finger on the pulse of. Sorry if my connection's been a bit poor.
That was much better. Thank you, Jack, for repeating that. And I appreciate those thoughts too. I also just want to clarify the comment in the chat regarding irrigation isn't about installing irrigation as part of this project. And Kyle may be able to talk a little bit more about it, but there were requests to add conduit sleeving for future irrigation specifically to some of the gardens that COG Design, Maria was asking about, that COG Design had worked on. Kyle, do you want to add anything else to that?
Well, the two areas are shown with a dark blue line at the entrance off of Park Drive as irrigation sleeve to entry garden. And then the only other thing we mentioned about irrigation was replacing the irrigation enclosure to have a more durable steel enclosure versus the wooden one that's there now.
So I know we're coming up on 7:30 and I want to respect everybody's time, although I'm happy to stay in chat too if people have other comments. Any other thoughts that anybody has while we're here? I also want to make sure that we give an update on the next steps too, once we get done having questions as well. Kristen, thank you. You've got your hand raised.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Kristen.
Sorry, I have spotty internet. I just wanted to thank everyone for their really careful thinking and their sensitivities about the garden. There were wonderful comments. If people haven't watched the previous videos on the nature of the garden itself, and do we need transit through it? Is it a passive garden? Is it an active garden? When I look at these plans, I'm just hoping for really beautiful, like a beautiful entry and beautiful outside perimeter, and a touch here and there, not major reconstructions. We certainly don't need an auditorium or anything in there. But I think this work is really great, and I just wanted to thank people for their work on it. The other thing is totally aside from that, I'm not sure what it's called, but in front of REI, part of the grid dam has been removed. I saw that this past week. And so the flow from the Emerald Necklace is now entering right near, I don't even know what to call that spaghetti bunch of streets. It's like Park Drive, and it's in front of REI, that complex where they're building the new grocery store. The grid work has been removed and water is flowing now at a higher level. I don't know how that will eventually impact things. But basically, I really like all these ideas, and thank you for all your work on it.
Perfect, thank you. I appreciate those comments. And yes, with the removal of the dam, that's something that we will absolutely be looking at. And it's something that we're talking with the Army Corps about as well, in terms of expectations for future water as part of the work that they've been doing as well. So we will definitely be keeping our eye on that for sure. Pam, you've also got your hand up.
One more comment. I think Marie asked about the possibility of raising the level in the meadow so that it was not so soggy. We actually see ducks swimming on the mud puddles in there in the springtime. I don't know if, as part of this project, bringing in compost or topsoil to raise that, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 inches is a possibility. And finally, I just want to say a huge thank you to you and Kyle for the work you've done and for listening to me talk so much. I really appreciate it. And I think this is a great project.
Well, thank you guys, and thank everybody on the call. We really appreciate all the comments for sure. Kyle, do you want to talk about the meadow puddle? And I know that with permitting and everything else, there's a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, we're going to have a balancing act in general with the project because as I showed early on, most of our site is in a floodplain. So anytime we raise the grade in the floodplain, we have to compensate for that somewhere else. In other words, like dig a hole somewhere. So if we were to raise the grade in the meadow, we've got to find another spot to take that equivalent fill out of the park.
So that's not a yes or a no. It's a part of the balancing act, but knowing that that's a thought and a concern that people have here, we'll definitely be looking at it as we're working through all of those numbers that we have to look at for permitting purposes too. Rob, would it be possible to go, I think maybe if we go back up to the schedule slide might be a good one for just making sure everybody knows our next steps too. And again, happy to continue talking about things, but I also just want to make sure that everybody knows what our next steps are. Also want to make sure for anybody that may not have it, or if you didn't get a personal email from me letting you know about this meeting, I'm happy to add you to my email list. Feel free to put your email in the chat, or if you registered, I'll have it. Or also feel free to email me. I'm putting that email address in the chat right now. We also have a couple of other meetings coming up. We have a general pathways meeting that will talk more about site furnishings, pathways, grading, lighting, materials, all of those things on March 28th. And then we'll have another meeting on April 13th where we'll talk about some other areas of the project like the War Memorial, the O'Reilly Monument, and the Evans Way Bridge. So I want to make sure that you all have the information on those meetings too. And again, we'll also have this, sorry, my voice is going out a little bit. We'll also have the meetings, the recordings from this meeting, as well as, like Kristen was saying, a lot of the ones from the past meetings are on there as well. They'll be on the project website. So I'm also going to put that in the chat for everybody to get that as well. Give us a couple days. Usually by like middle of next week, we'll end up having this presentation posted in the video and also some meeting notes as well. I know Allison also raised her hand, so I want to jump into that, but I just wanted to make sure before anybody starts jumping off that everybody knows our next steps and that we have those other very informative meetings coming up over the next week as well. Allison, you've got a question?
Yeah, hi, Lauren, a couple things. Wanted to thank you for the notes from the February meeting. They're also posted on your website. Yeah. Just wondering, maybe it's just my computer, but that the participants were not allowed to show our videos. So if that could change for the future meetings, it really is nice to see people's faces in meetings when we're doing all these virtual sessions.
Thank you for saying that. I was sort of wondering why nobody wanted to have me see them too. So I will say I really do appreciate that comment. Christine Brandeo, who is our outreach coordinator, left Boston Parks and headed for another job. And she went to BPDA. So we are right now filling the gaps until we have someone else in her position. And we thought we had all of the settings right on the Zoom because she usually does that for us. So I appreciate you pointing that out because like I said, I was sort of wondering why nobody wanted me to see them too.
I apologize. I may have clicked the wrong box. So my apologies for that, folks.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, no, thank you for pointing that out.
Okay.
It was not intentional.
next week. Thank you.
It wasn't intentional for sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you all.
Before you all run away, and I do have this captive audience, I am the coordinator for the Mayor's Garden Contest, and I'm still putting that together with this group in this specific area right here. I'm sure you guys are all aware of it, but July 12th is the deadline for the Mayor's Garden Contest. If you have any questions, you can email me at gardencontest@boston.gov. Usually I'll start promoting it until May, but I figured you guys are always in the know, so.
You guys got all the early info. That's awesome. Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight. I really appreciate the time, and as always with this group, I love the enthusiasm and the care that you guys have for this park. So I just really appreciate the time and all of your thoughts. So thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you all.
Thank you.